Hey there, welcome back. Or, if it's your first time here, welcome to the slowest paced history lecture you'll ever enjoy. I'm not here to keep you awake, quite the opposite. So, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let's ease our way into another chapter of the past. Today's bedtime story is about why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times. But don't worry, you won't have to. Let's begin in the early morning, somewhere in the heart of a medieval European town. Before you've even opened your eyes, the smell hits. Not just the faint whiff of earth or livestock, but human waste, rotting food, dead rats, and damp wood smoke. It clings to everything. There's no such thing as deodorant. Soap? Rare wet water? You'd be lucky to find clean water for drinking, let alone for bathing. And now, someone's shouting outside your wooden shuttered window. You hear it just in time. A yell of "Gardy-loo," followed by a splash. That wasn't rain. That was the contents of a chamber pot being hurled onto the street from an upper floor. People dump their waste out the window each morning, hoping the shout gives you enough time to step aside. But most don't bother. If you lived in a ground-level dwelling, your front door was caked in layers of mud and worse. You pull on your wool tunic. It's rough, scratchy, and hasn't been washed in a week, maybe longer. Fabric is expensive, and most people own one or two garments, worn until they're literally falling apart. Shoes. If you're lucky, you might have a pair made of stiff leather, already molding from the wet streets. Stepping outside, the air is heavy. Smoke drifts from cooking fires. There's no organized trash collection, no drainage, and the streets double as sewer and sidewalk. If it's raining, the mud is ankle-deep, sticky, and alive with movement. Flies buzz constantly. Rats scurry underfoot, and those little movements in the mud could be worms, could be worse. Now you're hungry. The bakery's open, but only just. Bread is dense, often made with rye or barley, and it's filled with bits of stone from the grinding process. People lose teeth from eating it, not over time, but during breakfast. If you're poor, it might be all you get today. If you're really poor, you might have to steal, and if you get caught, well, we'll talk about that later. There's a public well in the center of town. You'd think water from a fresh well is safe. But this is medieval Europe, and the well sits maybe 10 paces from the butcher's stall, where blood and animal waste run freely. On hot days, it mixes into a stinking puddle near the base. Still, water is better than ale, at least in theory. The local ale is weak, sour, and served warm, but it's boiled during brewing, which means fewer bacteria. So, most people, even children, drink it instead of water. Drunkenness isn't a vice. It's hydration. If you're a woman, your tasks begin before dawn. You're responsible for preparing meals, tending the fire, mending clothes, and caring for children, all of whom are probably already sick with something. A cough, a rash, diarrhea. It's all normal. You've likely buried one or two before the age of 30. Grief is constant, but not extravagant. It comes in sighs and long silences because crying doesn't change anything. Children run barefoot through the streets. Some have no pants. Diseases spread easily. The concept of germs hasn't been invented yet. No one washes their hands unless they've been gutting fish, and even then, it's a quick rinse in a shared basin. The local apothecary might offer dried herbs or powders, some of which are harmless. Others are not. Mercury, arsenic, crushed beetles. It's all part of the cure. Toothache? Try drilling a hole and packing it with garlic, or just yank the tooth out with pliers heated in a fire. No anesthesia. No clean tools. At church, everyone attends Mass, not because they believe, necessarily, but because it's required. The priest reads in Latin, a language no one understands, and preaches against sin. Sin includes working on holy days, eating meat on Fridays, or bathing too often. Yes, really. Too much bathing is suspicious. It hints at vanity, pride. A deadly sin. As the day unfolds, there's no such thing as privacy. Homes are shared, not just by families, but by livestock. Chickens under the bed. A goat in the corner. And if you live in the country, there's no difference between house and barn. You sleep where you eat, and you eat where you defecate. Disease spreads not through pandemics, but plagues. When one hits, it doesn't matter who you are, rich or poor. If the rats get in, you're next. Bubonic plague is the most famous, but smallpox, typhoid, and sweating sickness come and go like seasons. No hospitals, no doctors, just leeches, bleeding bowls, and desperate prayers. By late afternoon, the streets are filled with people yelling, bartering, and brawling. The smell of urine gets stronger in the heat. Beggars cry out. Children wrestle in the mud. A pig waddles through the crowd, eating everything it finds. Someone plays a hurdy-gurdy. Someone else vomits in a ditch. You work until sunset. Then you head home. Maybe you light a candle, if you can afford one. Most people go to sleep when it's dark. Not because they're tired, but because it's too expensive to stay awake. Oil lamps are precious. Firewood is rationed. Blankets are shared. If you're married, sex is scheduled. If you're not, it's forbidden, but only for women. As you lie down on your straw mattress, you scratch at your skin. Fleas. Everyone has them. Lice, too. You say your prayers, not because you believe, but because you're scared. Hell is real. It's everywhere. In your fever. In the rat bite. In the priest's warnings. And when you finally fall asleep, it's not a peaceful slumber, it's survival. Just one more night before you wake up and do it all again. Good night, and may your dreams be far, far away from the 14th century. Now, if you're still with me and haven't drifted off yet, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and let me know which century you'd actually want to visit. Maybe next time, we'll try something a little less deadly. Or maybe not. Either way, sleep well. Let's talk about food, because if you think you'd survive medieval cuisine with just a grumble and a shrug, think again. Imagine this. It's morning and you're hungry. Not forgot breakfast, hungry, but the kind of empty that comes from a life where food isn't guaranteed. You step into a smoky kitchen where a pot of something vaguely beige has been simmering for hours. That's pottage, the standard meal for peasants across medieval Europe. It's made from whatever was left from yesterday. Barley, cabbage, onions, maybe a carrot if you're lucky. No salt, no spice. Just heat, texture, and the slow understanding that this is the same thing you ate yesterday. And probably what you'll eat tomorrow. Meat, rare. Most people might eat meat a few times a year. It's heavily salted to keep it from rotting, unless you live on a noble's land and risk poaching, in which case you might get a rabbit or deer. But if you're caught, punishment is swift and public. A hand gone, maybe worse. And here's the catch. Even when food was available, it wasn't always safe. Ergot, a mold that grows on damp rye, causes hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. Entire villages were stricken by what they called holy fire, not realizing their bread was slowly poisoning them. Then there's the water. Clear streams and bubbling brooks? Not likely. Most available water sources are contaminated with waste, human, animal, industrial. If you drink it, you risk cholera, dysentery, or worse. Boiling helps, but fuel is precious. So instead, most people, even children, drink ale. Weak, sour, but at least it's been boiled. Milk, if you can keep it from spoiling. Otherwise, curdled lumps and a strange smell are the best-case scenario. Toilets, that's generous. In most towns, people simply used pots inside the house, then emptied them into the street. If you're lucky enough to be near a river, that might serve as a natural latrine. Castles had garderobes, basically a bench with a hole that led to a shaft. But the smell, overwhelming. Some noble homes had multiple garderobes stacked vertically, so you can imagine the engineering disasters when they clogged. And parasites? A given. Worms, fleas, lice, all standard. Children were born with them, lived with them, and often died with them. Hygiene was limited to quick rinses or wiping with straw. Yes, straw. That was the toilet paper. If you were refined, you might use moss or your hand. Bathing was rare, not just because of the cold, but because it was often considered dangerous. Doctors believed that water opened your pores to disease. Some even claimed that bathing too frequently could cause madness. Public bathhouses existed, but they were also centers for other kinds of business, and carried social stigma. For most people, bathing happened a few times a year, often in spring or summer. Winters. You just layered more clothes and hoped for the best. If you lived in the countryside, your food situation was worse in winter. No crops. Dried beans and root vegetables were stored, but they ran out fast. Hunger was normal. Starvation? Common. The Great Famine of 1315 lasted 3 years. People ate cats, dogs, and reportedly even corpses. Parents abandoned children. Children stole from the dying. Cannibalism, once whispered, became fact in some chronicles. Salt was essential, not for flavor, but for preservation. Salted fish, salted pork, salted everything. Without it, food would rot within days. But salt was expensive, sometimes taxed, sometimes controlled by lords or the crown. A peasant might trade half a day's wages for a small pouch of salt. Sugar, a luxury. Spices like pepper or cinnamon were worth more than gold in some markets. But not everything was bleak. On feast days, religious or local celebrations, food flowed. Pies filled with meat, fruits, or eggs. Roast pig, ale by the barrel. But these were exceptions, not rules. Most of the time, people ate to survive, not to enjoy. In towns, bakeries regulated bread through a guild system. There were laws about how much a loaf should weigh and cost. Bakers who cheated were punished, sometimes by being dragged through the streets with fake bread hung around their neck. But even with rules, bread could be filled with sawdust or ground bones to stretch flour supplies. And there were no refrigerators, no fridges, no preservatives beyond salt or smoke. Food went bad. People ate it anyway. The smell might give you pause, but if your stomach was empty, mold wasn't always a deal-breaker, especially when the alternative was nothing. Then there were the punishments. If you stole food, a loaf, a chicken, a sack of grain, you might be whipped, branded, or even hanged. Mercy was rare, and hunger wasn't a defense. Laws protected property, not survival. Now imagine being pregnant in this world. You're malnourished, you're exhausted, and you're still expected to cook, clean, fetch water, and raise other children. Infant mortality was so high that mothers often didn't name their children for days or even weeks, waiting to see if they would live. Life expectancy hovered around 30-35 years, though that average is skewed by high childhood deaths. If you made it to adulthood, you might live longer, but it would not be an easy road. So, when you next stand in your kitchen and wonder what to eat, consider this. In medieval times, it wasn't about flavor, variety, or convenience. It was about survival, and survival was never guaranteed. Drink your water, eat your salad, and be very, very thankful that no one's dumping their chamber pot out the window above you. Let's say you've made it through breakfast without losing a tooth to stale bread or falling ill from tainted water. Congratulations, but don't get too comfortable. Medieval health care is about to make things much worse. The human body in the Middle Ages wasn't seen the way we see it today. There were no germs, no bacteria, no understanding of viruses. Medicine was based on the balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, it meant one of those was out of balance. And the treatment, usually bleeding. Doctors, if you could call them that, weren't affordable for most people. Licensed physicians trained in universities were rare and often more philosophical than practical. Most relied on ancient Greek texts, particularly those of Galen, who had never dissected a human body in his life. Instead, he based his anatomy on pigs and monkeys. If you were lucky, your town had a barber surgeon, a man with sharp tools, a steady hand, and 0 anesthesia. He might pull your tooth, lance a boil, or set a broken bone, all in the same hour. The iconic red and white barber pole? That came from the blood-soaked rags they hung outside to dry. Surgery was brutal. There were no gloves, no sterilization, no understanding of infection. Tools were reused, unwashed. Amputations were done quickly, often with assistants holding the patient down. Wounds were cauterized with hot iron. If you screamed, no one blamed you. Screaming was expected. But many didn't even get that. If you were poor, you saw the local wise woman or herbalist. She might brew a tea of willow bark for pain, effective since it contains the same active ingredient as aspirin, or apply poultices made from herbs, honey, and occasionally animal dung. Some of these treatments worked, most didn't. And if a healing went wrong, she might be accused of witchcraft. Let's talk about childbirth. There were no hospitals, no prenatal care. You gave birth at home, usually surrounded by other women. No epidural, no antiseptics, just hot water, cloths, and prayers. Mortality rates were terrifying. Many women didn't survive childbirth, and many babies didn't survive their first month. If a baby was born deformed or sickly, it was often seen as a punishment, divine or demonic. Dentistry, almost non-existent. If you had a toothache, the standard treatment was extraction. No numbing, no tools designed for comfort. Sometimes the local blacksmith helped out. Teeth were pulled with pliers, and sometimes part of your jaw came with it. Dental hygiene was minimal. A cloth wipe, maybe some herbs to chew. Cavities were common, and infections could kill. Plagues were the Great Terror. The Black Death, bubonic plague, arrived in Europe around 1347 and killed up to 60% of the population in some areas. It was fast, gruesome, and deeply mysterious to those living through it. Swollen lymph nodes, blackened skin, vomiting blood, and death, often within days. People didn't understand rats carried fleas that transmitted the disease. Instead, they blamed the stars, bad air, or divine punishment. Some believed it was caused by sin, and entire towns held processions of flagellants, men who whipped themselves bloody to atone for humanity's crimes. If you showed symptoms, your neighbors might nail your door shut. You were trapped inside with your family, no help, no escape. Those who died were buried in mass graves, sometimes without ceremony. The smell of decay was overwhelming. Leprosy was another feared disease. Lepers were forced to live outside towns, often in colonies, and required to carry a bell to warn others of their approach. But many lepers weren't even contagious. They just had visible skin conditions. Still, the stigma was powerful. Mental illness was seen as demonic possession. There were no therapists, no understanding of trauma or chemical imbalance. If you heard voices, you might be chained to a wall, exorcised, or worse. Some were hidden away by families. Others became objects of ridicule. Hospitals did exist, but not for healing, not in the modern sense. They were places of rest for the dying, run by the church. Monks and nuns offered prayers, clean linens, and what little comfort they could. But without medicine, recovery was rare. Often, these institutions were overwhelmed during epidemics, becoming little more than holding pens for the doomed. People feared death, but they also lived closely with it. Cemeteries were full. Bones were often dug up and reused to make space. Charnel houses held skulls, femurs, and rib cages stacked like firewood. Death wasn't hidden. It was part of the scenery. And yet, despite the pain and fear, many people still found meaning. They believed in an afterlife. They made peace with suffering as a test of faith. Martyrs were admired. Saints were prayed to. Relics, a saint's finger bone, a vial of their blood, were thought to hold healing powers. It wasn't all bleak. Some herbal remedies worked. Honey, for example, has natural antibacterial properties and was used on wounds. Lavender soothed the nerves. Garlic fought infections. But these remedies weren't always trusted. Church leaders sometimes condemned folk medicine as pagan or heretical. So, if you lived in medieval times and caught a fever, your odds weren't good. If it wasn't the illness that killed you, the treatment might. And even if you survived, you'd bear the scars, literal and emotional, for life. There was no promise of health. No expectation of growing old. A single cut could fester. A cough could linger for months. A blister could mean infection, then sepsis. And there was no cure, no miracle drug, no modern intervention. Only faith, luck, and resilience. So next time you reach for aspirin, schedule a dentist visit, or pour a clean glass of water. Take a moment. You're not just living in a different time. You're surviving where others wouldn't have. If you think medieval life was hard already, just wait until you step into the shoes of the working class, because for the vast majority of people, over 90% of the population, daily life wasn't just uncomfortable. It was unrelenting. From before sunrise to well after sunset, your day belonged to someone else. You didn't have a job. You had an obligation to your lord, your guild, your field, your debt. You were a peasant, a tenant, a serf, or an apprentice, and that meant you worked or you starved. Let's say you're a serf. You don't own land, you work as someone else's. Legally, you're not a slave, but the difference is small. You can't leave the estate without permission. You can't marry without your lord's approval. You owe a portion of your harvest to him, and when the tax collector comes, you owe him too, in grain, chickens, or labor. Sometimes all three. Your day begins before dawn, not with a stretch and a yawn, but with a jolt awake in the cold, often by the sound of animals or the creaking of a wooden shutter. You pull on your stiff clothes, probably still damp from yesterday's work. There's no breakfast waiting. Maybe a crust of bread. Maybe nothing. You go to the fields, plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting. The rhythm of your life is tied to the land, the weather, and the whims of a feudal system that takes more than it gives. You work with primitive tools, a wooden plow, a scythe, your bare hands. Blisters turn to calluses. Calluses split in winter frost. There are no gloves, no breaks, no workers' rights, and when it rains, you keep working. When it's too hot, you keep working. When you're sick, you keep working. Because stopping means falling behind, and falling behind means punishment or hunger. Your hands are never clean. They're caked in dirt, manure, sap, and blood from slaughtering livestock or gutting fish. Your back aches constantly. Your teeth rot. You haven't seen a mirror in weeks, maybe months. If you're an apprentice in a town, it's not much better. You live with your master, eat what he gives you, work as long as he says. If he beats you, no one intervenes. You're property until your apprenticeship ends, which might take 7 years. You sleep in the workshop. You wake with the sun. You carry water, stoke fires, scrub floors, and dream of becoming a master someday, though most never do. For women, the labor is doubled. You grind grain by hand, fetch water in buckets from miles away, tend gardens, raise children, cook over open flames, and care for animals. And when your husband is conscripted for war or work, you take on his duties too. There's no such thing as rest. Even childbirth isn't a break, it's a risk. Children don't have childhoods. By age 5, they're working. In the fields, herding animals, picking herbs, sweeping floors. They're small, fast, and expendable. They die easily and are replaced easily. Harsh? Yes. But that's how it was. The concept of leisure was different. There were festivals, yes, holy days, market fairs, weddings. But those were rare and often exhausting. They meant preparation, travel, social pressure. You dressed in your best, which still stank. You ate well, if you could afford it, and then returned to work with a headache and less money. Punishments for failing to meet obligations were brutal. Late with taxes, expect your crops confiscated, caught poaching, you could be flogged or mutilated. Disobey a noble, hanged. Disobey the church, burned. Justice was swift, often public, and always painful. Stocks in the town square. Branding. Whipping posts. Executioners weren't rare, they were regular employees. And if war broke out, which it did often, you had no say. Your field might become a battlefield. Your livestock slaughtered. Your home burned. Your daughter taken. Your son conscripted. War didn't come with warning. It came with fire and boots and blood. Guilds offered some protection in towns. If you were a skilled artisan, a blacksmith, a tanner, a weaver, the guild regulated your trade, prices, quality, and training. But entry was hard. Corruption was rampant. And if you weren't a man, forget it. The church preached that labor was virtuous, that suffering was noble, that paradise awaited the humble, and people believed it, because it was all they had. Hope deferred endlessly. The afterlife was your only retirement plan. Education was for the clergy and elite. If you could read, you were rare. If you could write, you were exceptional. Most people lived and died without ever seeing a book. Knowledge was expensive, guarded, and handwritten on parchment. Schools existed, but you needed money, connections, or both. Even your freedom wasn't guaranteed. Debt bondage was common. If you couldn't pay taxes or repay a loan, you might sell yourself into servitude, or be forced. Entire families could fall into generational servitude from one bad harvest. Starvation, not ambition, drove most life decisions, and still people endured. They married, they laughed, they told stories by firelight. They carved spoons, embroidered tunics, sang crude songs while threshing wheat. Not because life was good, but because the alternative was silence. So, next time you complain about your 9 to 5, think about a 5 to 9 that never ends. No weekends, no holidays, no security, just work, obedience, and the thin hope that your children might have it slightly less terrible than you. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. So maybe you're thinking, okay, but what if I were a noble? You know, silk robes, roaring fires, endless banquets in candlelit halls. Surely that life was better? Yes and no. Let's begin with the basics. Nobility meant power, land, and influence. You had vassals. You had servants. You had a coat of arms and a family name that turned heads. You also had enemies, parasites, assassination attempts, and responsibilities that would crush most modern CEOs. It wasn't a luxury retreat. It was a brutal game of survival, just played at a higher level. Your home was likely a stone castle. Sounds romantic, right? High towers, stone walls, maybe a moat. But these were not cozy places. They were cold, freezing cold. Stone doesn't insulate. Windows were tiny slits built for archers, not sunlight. Fires roared in great halls, but heat didn't reach bedrooms. Most nobles slept in their clothes under layers of fur. You could see your breath indoors, even while wrapped in velvet. And velvet? Scratchy? Wool? Heavy? Linen? Rare in winter. Nothing was ever really clean. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs didn't care how rich you were. Perfume masked the smell. It didn't remove it. Food was better, mostly. You ate meat regularly, sometimes multiple times a day. Roasted swan, venison, pork pies, fish soaked in wine sauces. But that meat sat on trenchers, thick slices of stale bread that soaked up grease and were tossed to the poor or dogs. Cutlery existed, but fingers were still the primary tool. And food was seasoned heavily, not for flavor, but to cover the taste of decay. Even in castles, preservation was primitive. Spices were a status symbol, and rotting food disguised with cloves or vinegar was still rotting food. Toilets in castles? Garderobes, little stone alcoves built into the walls, where waste dropped down a chute to the outer wall or moat. The stench was constant. The toilet room was often built high to let gravity assist, but wind blew the smell back up. Some castles installed rushes and herbs in corners to help absorb it. They didn't work. Still, nobles had servants, and lots of them. Pages, squires, cooks, grooms, stewards. They bathed you, dressed you, held your chamber pot, and managed your estates. But trust was dangerous. Servants could be bribed, blackmailed, or coerced. Poison was a real threat. Nobles employed tasters for a reason. Marriage wasn't about love. It was a transaction, land, titles, alliances. A 13-year-old might be married to a 40-year-old for political advantage. Affairs were expected. Legitimate heirs were not guaranteed. If you were a noblewoman, your job was to produce sons. Failure meant disgrace. Success meant more pressure. And then there was war. If you were male and of noble blood, you trained from childhood for it. Swordsmanship, riding, falconry, tactics. You learned to wear armor, 40 kilos of steel plates, and fight while wearing it. Battles were vicious, chaotic, and personal. You could be crushed by a horse, suffocated under bodies, or bled out in mud while someone stole your boots. Knights were romanticized in later centuries, but in their own time they were feared. Killing was their profession. Their code, chivalry, applied mostly to other nobles. Peasants were fair game. Mercy wasn't guaranteed. Weapons were brutal. Maces shattered skulls. Poleaxes pierced armor. Warhammers crushed rib cages. Archers could send arrows through joints or eyes. And even if you survived the battle, infection from a wound could kill days later. Sieges were worse. Imagine being trapped in your own castle, food dwindling, water tainted, the enemy camped outside. They launched dead animals over the walls, human corpses, fire. They poisoned wells. They starved you out. Months could pass in stalemate. Then, finally, the walls would fall, and the slaughter began. Honor? Sometimes, but not always. Surrender didn't guarantee survival. Castles were sacked. Nobles beheaded. Ladies raped, children thrown from towers. No one was immune, and even in peace, politics were deadly. Plots festered in courts. Whispers in corridors, forged letters, secret meetings, a misstep, a wrong alliance, an insult, a debt, and your head could end up on a pike. Religion complicated things. Nobles were expected to fund chapels, sponsor monasteries, go on pilgrimage, and maintain piety, at least publicly. Sins could be cleansed by donating land to the church, but that didn't mean they were saints. Some nobles lived like warlords, drunken feasts, brutal justice, lavish indulgences. Entertainment was limited. Hunting was the king of pastimes, literally. Falconry was status. Chess was for strategy. Music was live. Lutes, flutes, voices echoing through halls. Storytellers and jesters entertained in evenings. But boredom was constant. Books were rare. Travel was dangerous, and gossip could ruin lives. So yes, being a noble meant eating better, sleeping under a roof, wearing finer clothes. But it also meant constant vigilance, political anxiety, and physical danger. You were a target for rival families, jealous allies, rebellious vassals, even your own kin. And remember, the higher you rose, the farther you had to fall. One accusation, one military defeat, one royal favor withdrawn, and you could lose everything. Your lands seized, your family imprisoned, your name erased. Because in medieval times, power was never permanent. It was borrowed, at sword point, from those slightly weaker than you, and they were always watching. Religion was everywhere in medieval life, not as a quiet personal belief, but as a total system of control, fear, and routine. It dictated what you ate, when you worked, who you married, how you dressed, and where your soul would end up for eternity. From the moment you were born, the church was involved. Baptism was urgent. Babies were baptized within days, sometimes hours, to protect their souls from limbo. The priest held the child over a stone font, mumbled Latin prayers no one understood, and poured cold water over its tiny head. If the child died before the ceremony, its soul was believed lost. So even in birth there was fear. Church bells rang constantly. They marked time, warned of storms, called for mass, signaled death. The sound wasn't just familiar, it was authoritative. You could measure your whole day by it, and you went to church. Not occasionally. Every week, often multiple times. Attendance was expected. Missing Mass without reason could lead to fines, social shame, or worse. Inside the church, you didn't sit comfortably in pews. You stood for hours. The priest faced away from you, spoke in Latin, and conducted the ritual with incense, robes, and mystery. The altar was distant. Communion was rare. Most people didn't even know what was being said, but they went, because not going meant eternal consequences. Confession was mandatory. Sins weren't private. You knelt before the priest, listed your crimes, and received penance. Prayer, fasting, or punishment. Gossip, penitence, jealousy. Penitence, doubt, dangerous. Heresy, deadly. And the church wasn't just spiritual, it was political. Bishops owned land. Monasteries collected taxes. Clergy acted as judges, advisors, and bureaucrats. They lived in wealth while preaching poverty. Some were pious, others were corrupt. All were powerful. Fear ruled doctrine. Hell was not a metaphor. It was a burning, screaming certainty. Preachers described it in detail: fire, demons, agony. Heaven was distant, conditional, and selective. Most people expected purgatory, an in-between realm of suffering where souls burned off sin before entering paradise. And you could shorten your time there, with money. That's where indulgences came in. Pay a fee, receive a spiritual pardon. It was business cloaked in theology. Relics were everywhere: a bone from a saint, a drop of Christ's blood, a splinter from the true cross. People traveled for days to see them. Touching one could heal. Stealing one could start wars. Most were fake, but belief made them powerful. Miracles were expected. Saints cured blindness. Statues cried. Bread turned to flesh. And when the church couldn't explain something, a storm, a crop failure, a sudden illness, the explanation turned dark. Superstition filled the gaps in knowledge. People believed in signs, omens, charms, curses. A black cat crossing your path? Dangerous? A dream of teeth falling out? Death? A wart on the wrong finger? Witchcraft and witches, they were real, or rather, belief in them was. Mostly women, often elderly or poor, were accused of casting spells, poisoning wells, turning into animals. A failed harvest, a dying cow, a sick child. Anything unexplainable could be blamed on a neighbor. Accusations spread fast. Evidence was not needed. A birthmark, a mole, an odd look, that was enough. Trials for witches were brutal. They involved dunking in water. If you float, you're guilty. Pressing with weights, stripping and shaving to find the witch's mark. Confessions were forced under torture. Burning at the stake was common. Hysteria grew. Villages turned on their own, and the irony? The church sometimes protected official magic. Holy relics, sanctioned blessings, even astrology used for calendars. But folk healing, especially by women, was condemned. Fear controlled people. And it wasn't just fear of hell. It was fear of excommunication, being cut off from the church, from society, from salvation. It meant you couldn't marry, trade, or even be buried in consecrated ground. It was social death. Pilgrimage was encouraged, walking barefoot for weeks, even months, to visit a shrine. Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Jerusalem. It was penance. It was devotion. It was exhausting. Many died along the way, from hunger, exposure, or bandits. But reaching the destination meant indulgences, forgiveness, a fresh start. Monks and nuns lived apart, in cloisters, cells, silence. Some were devout. Others were forced into religious life to avoid dowries or division of land. Monasteries produced books, preserved knowledge, served the poor. But they also hoarded wealth, exploited labor, and lived far better than most of the flock they served. And then came the Inquisition, a system designed to root out heresy by interrogation, surveillance, torture. It wasn't just about belief, it was about control. Neighbor denounced neighbor. Families were destroyed. Secrets became dangerous. A misquoted prayer, a misunderstood passage, enough to be burned alive. Despite all this, people found comfort in faith. It gave meaning to suffering. It provided rituals for birth, marriage, and death. It offered hope, however distant, of something better beyond the pain. Churches were more than buildings. They were anchors, sanctuaries in name, if not always in function. Their bells told the rhythm of life. Their walls heard every cry, confession, and hymn, and their shadow stretched far beyond the grave. Because in the medieval world, salvation wasn't a right. It was a negotiation, one that never truly ended. So, here we are, at the end of your first full day in the Middle Ages. You made it, barely, and not without some bruises, infections, hunger pangs, and psychological scars. But somehow you endured the stench, the chamber pots, the bloodletting, the burning, the darkness, and the long, bone-deep cold. Let's take a breath. Look around your modern room. The clean sheets, the electric light, the thermostat holding the temperature steady. That quiet hum in the background? That's your refrigerator, full of food that won't kill you. You have a shower with hot water. You have painkillers in the drawer. You can Google symptoms, schedule a dentist, watch a film, and sleep in peace. No rats, no lice, no fear of screaming crowds outside your door with torches and rope. And that, more than anything, is what defined medieval life. Fear. Fear of sin. Fear of disease. Fear of war. Fear of your lord, your neighbor, your own body. You were born into it, raised in it, shaped by it, and you carried it to your grave, likely before the age of 40. Even joy was complicated. You couldn't laugh too loudly in church. You couldn't dance too late on feast days. You couldn't eat too well during Lent. There was a rule, a season, a saint, or a sin to consider for everything. And even if you obeyed them all, there were still famines, plagues, raiders, and accidents waiting around the corner. People were resilient. They had to be. They adapted. They sang, carved, painted, played music. They made art, built cathedrals, raised children, told stories, found ways to hope. But never forget the scale of human suffering behind it all. The millions who lived and died in quiet agony, unrecorded, unnamed. History remembers the kings, the generals, the popes, but most of the people who lived through these centuries, the field workers, bakers, shepherds, tailors, mothers, daughters, lost boys, and tired old men, vanished without trace. No gravestone, no portrait, just a shallow grave and a line in a dusty parish ledger. And yet we are here, because they were, because they survived long enough to carry life forward, generation by generation, through fire, famine, frost, and fear. They did it without antibiotics, without electricity, without safety nets or warning systems or clean water. They built the bones of the world we now live in, often without knowing it. So maybe when we complain about slow Wi-Fi or long checkout lines or lukewarm coffee, we should stop, just for a moment. And remember, you wouldn't last a day in the Middle Ages, but they, somehow, lasted centuries. If you're still here, still listening, still awake, thank you for sharing this quiet journey back through one of history's most brutal, strange, and endlessly fascinating chapters. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Leave a like. Share this with someone who thinks they could have handled a sword and a stone castle. And now, let yourself drift off. To silence. To warmth. To the world you're lucky enough to wake up in. Good night.